Hi there, I'm Stan Baker, one of the hosts of Circle Forum, along with Shelley Steele and Steve Young. Our guest again this week for part 2 is Amy Newman, principal of Newton Elementary in Surrey, British Columbia. Amy's experience in school leads this interesting conversation with her advice for new principals and vice principals. First, it's a shift to move from teaching to principling. Secondly, be intentional about building relationships with teachers, staff, parents, and students. Thirdly, create space for teachers to have professional conversations. And fourthly, model community building for your staff.
This week's episode is brought to you by Green Spaces. Research has shown that access to green spaces is associated with better mental health outcomes. People who live near or have regular access to green spaces tend to experience lower levels of stress, anxiety, and depression. So get out and enjoy a green space because it's good for you and your mental health.
At the end of this episode, be sure to visit our website, www.restorative.ca, where you can find some great leadership ideas from a restorative relational perspective. If you enjoy this episode, be sure to subscribe on Spotify or YouTube. Shelley and Steve are away this week, so let's head over to the conversation with me, Stan. When you went into principling, you probably had an idea of where you were going to be spending most of your time and energy versus where you actually spend your time and energy. So how has that worked out, and what kind of advice is in that for new principals and vice principals?
I think it's sometimes a difficult segue from teaching to principling, especially as a vice principal when you're still often teaching 4 days a week. So you have a different role, a different sort of authoritative level, shall we say, yet essentially you're teaching all day, every day. So you're still connecting with students and staff. The shift, I think, comes to when you become a principal and you have the tremendous responsibility of keeping all of these human beings and their families feeling safe, feeling comfortable, and learning. That's a tremendous amount of responsibility. Just the physical safety and being of students, which you're looking at mental health, housing insecurity, food insecurity. So just feeling like you're really working hard to support the well-being of students and families can be quite significant. And then I think recognizing that your advocacy and your time and energy also needs to be focused on staff. And that's a big shift, I think, after teaching, when you spent much of your career so focused on students and families. And now you're working with adults and you're working with staff, and they have different ideas, but I think always working to surface norms. What does the staff what does a functional, happy day at work look like for you? What does a staff that cares about each other look like? These sort of, they call it stealth norming, these where you're really working on these norms and trying hard to get, you're not always going to get consensus, but just these norming practices where you can state how you want to go about doing your business together, working through the day together. What kind of supports do you need? What's helpful for you? And staff want different things. So I think that's a piece of it. And then, of course, these just day-to-day interactions where you're saying, how was your weekend? Oh, you were in Toronto. How was it? Did you get to the play? How was it? And so and I am generally extremely very curious person. I think that helps me because I'm always following up with questions about their children or their lives or their health or their well-being or what they're up to, or supporting staff to move on to the next level if they want to ladder up in any way. I think there's a like an intentionality about that. That's not a happenstance thing. That's an intentional these are intentional acts, and they're still sincere acts, but that, I think that matters. People want to feel valued, they want to feel seen and heard, and they want to feel like their principal cares about them and will go to bat for them. There's a lot of different ways to get there, but I think ultimately they want to feel like we all do, like they matter.
I really appreciate that intentionality. Like it's not something that just happens by accident. You're very intentional about the checking in with and building those connections with staff. And everything that you mentioned that you were checking in on had nothing to do with school. It had everything to do with their lives, right? You said the play, the weekend, the visit to whatever. Like you're not checking in on the lesson, at least this kind of building connections. And that's something I think that new principals and vice principals can quite easily miss because of the demands of the job.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is one of the things I love about the job is the emergent nature of it. A lot of people want the security of knowing they're going to go to their job and it's going to be like it was yesterday and maybe what it'll be tomorrow, but
And that's
I
not your
think
experience as principal.
not at all. Every day you're like, oh, there's the crazy stuff we deal with, and it's just every day it's different. And right in the middle of taking the apples out of the boys' toilets in the washroom, and then somebody pulls the fire drill, and then the food that you've ordered is delivered. And I don't mean your personal food, like this, like maybe the firefighters arrive, and it's just it goes on and on. And then particular child ends up at your door, and a staff member is sick. It's just these layers and layers of stuff, and I actually very much enjoy the emergent nature of the job because it's always interesting when it's always something different, and I think that keeps it interesting for me. I'm sure other principals
Yeah.
are thinking, if they're listening, they're saying, she's crazy. I just want to have a calm, predictable day. But there's no such thing in our work.
There is no such thing at all. And in that busyness and in that emergent nature of the work, there needs to be time to be able to reflect and talk with the teachers as a group, as a smaller group. How have you created space to have conversations with teachers?
That's a great question. Sometimes there's informal conversations, of course. The early birds come and I'm an early bird, so we always chat informally in the morning. For something like a school-wide initiative, we will sometimes have grade groups working together on something like a school-wide write or something, and we will release teachers for those discussions. And I think it's really important that the principal or vice principal is present for these professional conversations. So we might have 4, 5, 6 classes outside and being watched by maybe some non-enrolling teacher or the one administrator, because it's a large group. But then I'll be able to embed myself in the conversation. And that actually took place about a month and a half ago, what I'm describing. And the conversations about the writing process and practices with the teachers was so interesting. And they were talking about the different, of course, we've let go of letter grades long ago, and we're using like proficiency scales in our district, and how the kind of buckets, one of the teachers said, is so broad. Our students might be developing plus, but they might not still be proficient, and they wish they had less wide bands, because it takes quite a lot for a student to step into the next level kind of thing. And I think grades present the same problem, frankly, but just having those conversations and hearing about how making space for those conversations where you're releasing, it's not possible weekly or anything, but where you're releasing staff to just meet and chat, and you're listening, and you're adding in a little bit, but mainly you're listening and asking probing questions. How do you think we could do better at this? Or does that work for you? And why do you think these students aren't yet proficient? And what's happening? What do you think that's about? And so just being really curious and finding time for those conversations. And then further to that, Stan, to also try to make time, and it's very challenging, I know, at a staff meeting to just start with a prompt such as turn to the person you're sitting next to, or sometimes we randomly group with cards, or there's a lot of varieties, ways to randomly group. We might randomly group and just say, tell the person you're sitting next to or standing next to something you're really proud of. Just a small prompt like that. And then it creates quite a buzz. And it's not just sitting and listening. There is always some sitting and listening, but these moments where we can really provoke some really meaningful conversation is really important.
I'm reminded in that of how important those little prompting questions are, and love to use them regardless of the group that's together as a way of just setting a bit of tone, maybe getting a bit of an emotional read on where everybody's at. And I remember starting out with using circles in particular in meetings at the board office, for example. And I happened to be leading the meeting, and the assistant superintendent was in the meeting, very supportive individual. And we were meeting with a number of community agencies and stuff like that. And I started off with one of these questions, and we just worked our way around the circle. We had a 2-hour meeting, and I could tell she was getting a little bit anxious because, as someone in her position, I've got this meeting at 1:30, and I've got that meeting at 3:30, and I've got that meeting at 4, and that one at 5, and then I've got an evening commitment. So come on, Stan, let's go. And she told me afterwards, she said, I couldn't believe that you were taking time out of our meeting to ask this kind of question. But then she said, we were able to get through everything that we wanted to get through in the meeting. And she said, I was able to learn something about every person that was there. Some of the things I was not aware of at all. And it's that getting to know you in the middle of the work that we're doing together that I think is so valuable.
I really like that story because this idea of time out of our meeting, it's actually time in the meeting, and it's really purposeful time. And it it's it's also iterative because we sometimes do these, have various conversations or whatnot, and then we bring those back. Remember, we were talking about this and you were feeling this or thinking about this, or we left with this. How's that now? And just try to build on that, build on those conversations. It's flipping the traditional let's get down to business a little bit on its head, and taking time to really care about who's in the room.
Exactly. Three of my favorite questions on a regular basis, and they can be used individually or all together, are what's something you're planning? It doesn't have to be school, but what's something you're planning? What's something you're celebrating? And what's something you've learned? And you can use any one, or you can use all three, and then people can answer all three or any one that they like. And it's uncanny to discover connections between people in the room, to suddenly discover some connections that people might not have recognized, because how often does the grade 6 teacher see the kindergarten teacher in the hall? And guess what? They're both planning a trip to Mexico. What ends up happening is that there end up being connections. And the same thing I've discovered happens in classroom. When you take the time, it's not out of the lesson, it's in the lesson, right? To ask a leading question that can prompt the participants to talk a little bit about themselves so that you can find out things about them and from them that helps in terms of just relating to them, as you said, as human beings.
One of the ways we tried to do that this year, I like to have my admin day, which is our day in September rather than the end of the year, because I want to bond with new staff and such. And we had the balls of yarn, I'm sure you've seen.
Oh,
And
yes.
we were all over the school in circles, and someone would say something that was true about themselves, and you had to say, just like me, or something like that. And I think that's a Bruce Wellman strategy, actually. And so we had our yarn, and if you say just like me, I toss the ball to you, and eventually we're holding this really intricate web, and the connections are just visible in front of you. And it's a beautiful activity to connect. And then I asked, if you'd like to take the yarn into your classroom, you can certainly think about doing this with your students. And then the next week, all the yarn was gone. They asked for more yarn, and people were tossing. You could go by classrooms and see these, circles forming. And so in a way, you're modeling some of those things, but also just showing the importance of finding some connecting point, some commonality. So you feel like you have community. It's just the very first tentative steps into really creating community is that connection.
As Amy Newman says, principals must balance the needs of students, staff, and families, including addressing issues related to physical and mental well-being. New principals will do well to prioritize building connections with staff by being genuinely curious about their lives outside of school and by releasing teachers for collaborative discussions. New principals can encourage reflective dialogue even during staff meetings. It's important for new principals to create a sense of belonging for staff. Find out more about our work with restorative practices and school leaders at www.restorative.ca. Email me, stan@restorative.ca, and making the shift from teaching to principling requires action. And there's more. Part 3 with Amy Newman is coming soon, so stay tuned.